No.
All right, let's turn now to Ukraine. Several developments out of that country this morning. Right now, the U.S. Embassy in the capital of Kyiv is shut down as it warns of a potentially significant aerial attack. In a post on social media, the State Department is warning American citizens be prepared to immediately shelter in the event an air alert is announced. This comes a day after Ukraine fired long-range ATACMS missiles into Russia for the first time. That's according to two U.S. officials who spoke to NBC News. Russia's defense ministry confirms 5 of 6 missiles were shot down over a region that borders northern Ukraine. The 6th was struck in midair and its fragments landed on a military facility, causing a fire. Meanwhile, President Biden reportedly has authorized the provision of anti-personnel landmines to Ukraine, that for the first time, changing his own policy. Join us now, former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, retired 4-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis. He's Chief International Analyst for NBC News. He authored a new piece for Bloomberg titled, "Ukraine and Russia Can Find Peace with a DMZ." Admiral, great to have you with us at the table as always. We'll get to your piece in just a minute, but let's talk about those ATACMS that President Biden has now said, Ukraine, go ahead and use them. How does that change the dynamic in the war?
Yeah, let's do it tactically, operationally, strategically. So tactically, this is going to have real impact immediately. I don't believe the Russian Ministry of Defense. I think those missiles probably had immediate tactical impact. They were used against ammunition sites and the staging areas, Willie, for the North Korean troops. Operationally, this is going to force Putin to kind of spread his forces a little more thinly, to worry more about his logistics hubs, and to prepare to conduct air defense, something he hasn't had to do in significant ways. That's a cost on his military. And then strategically, what I think the Biden team is about, and it's a smart play, is to give Volodymyr Zelensky as many chips for the bargaining table as he can possibly have. He's holding a chunk of Russia around Kursk. Here's another bargaining chip, ATACMS missiles. So I think there are implications in all domains.
This war just crossed the 1,000-day mark, and there are a lot of people who say it would have been nice for Ukraine to have had these ATACMS a year ago, a year and a half ago. What do you think?
I'd substitute for the word ATACMS F-16s. Would have been great to have those a year ago. A-1 tanks, substitute. Would have been great to have those 2 years ago. We've been always slightly behind. I understand the theory that you don't want to provoke a nuclear armed power, Willie. Got it. On the other hand, we've seen again and again Putin has failed to respond to his own so-called red lines.
So let's take bigger picture here. This is this White House trying to rush as much help as it can to Ukraine because the clock is ticking. They know when Donald Trump takes office on January 20th, U.S. policy towards Kyiv likely going to change dramatically. So we talked about the ATACMS, the landmines, a controversial choice to be sure. What else can be done, realistically can be done between now and January 20th?
I think at this point, the short answer is so often Plan B is to work harder on Plan A. And what I mean by that is in the remaining 60 days or so, put all your force behind the logistics, get as much of this kit to the battlefield, get as much support to the commander of U.S. European Command, my successor, also Supreme Allied Commander, General Chris Cavoli. Load him up. He'll get it moving. Get as much of it in train as you can, and see where the Trump administration actually lands.
You know, Admiral, we are clearly in a transition period here in between administrations.
Yeah.
Everything you've been talking about and responding to the questions here this morning has to do with the Defense Department, the reach, the power, the immense impact of the Defense Department, both on the United States reputation around the globe and on a daily basis around the globe. What's your view of the furor that has erupted over the potential successor as Secretary of Defense?
Let me make an initial point, Mike, which is all around the world, forward deployed soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, this is all white noise to them, to be honest. They are focused on their operational tasks. So we were joking before the call. You asked me, what would it be like to be out on an aircraft carrier right now in command? It would be wonderful. Because no one out there, believe me, is following all this. Having said that, the Department of Defense needs experience at its helm. And so anytime you are putting a candidate forward who doesn't have the requisite experience, you are going to end up in a place where the department will move less with less alacrity. It will move with less spirit. Therefore, in the end, even though those operational forces are not following this, they are going to be impacted by it, whoever ends up leading that department.
Ed Luce has a question for you. And Ed, really quickly, I'm curious, what is NATO's response? What is Britain's response to Joe Biden and the administration giving Ukraine more weapons that strike deeper into Russia?
Well, countries like Britain and Poland have been pushing quite hard for the Americans to do that. Britain has its own Storm Shadow. It's an Anglo-French artillery that also has a longer range, and those have been lifted, but it required American permission to do so. So this also affects those. I mean, I'm fascinated, Admiral, by the leverage this gives an incoming Donald Trump to persuade Putin to come to the negotiating table, because right now he's showing no signs of interest in bargaining with Zelensky, because he thinks he's gaining more on the ground. And why give up? Why freeze? Does this make Putin think again? Is this in effect a gift from Biden to Trump to get these talks started after January the 20th?
You could look at it that way, Ed. I like to think it's a gift from Biden to Zelensky, who is going to have to go to that negotiating table. You know, Mika read that interesting piece about the massive casualties in the American Civil War. That's the other piece of the puzzle for Vladimir Putin. He's lost 200,000 killed in action, 400,000 who are grievously wounded, 600,000 who have left the country to avoid the draft. He is now approaching civil war-like levels of casualties. It's a terrifying thing, in my view, if you are a member of the Russian population. So I think between the bargaining chips, you're absolutely right. The chunk of territory that the Ukrainians hold of Russia, the new ATACMS, the F-16s, which are starting to have real impact, those are operational military bargaining chips. On the other side of it is going to be casualties inflicted on Russia. Those two things, I think, might help get Putin to the bargaining table.
I want to ask you really quickly about the cost of this war on Russia. We know on Ukraine, obviously, because we see it every day. But, you know, the Biden administration's been criticized by both sides, whether it's the isolationists on the right and the left, or whether it's the people who, you know, basically want him to march, you know, have Ukraine march into Moscow. He's always been hammered, second guessed. He's always had to worry. And as James Baker always said, president's first goal, avoiding nuclear war. Yeah. And after that, then you figure everything else out. But I just want us to look, how will history 20, 30 years from now look at this war thus far, and how much it has decimated the number two, and they are, Russia, the number two military in the world? What is the generational impact of the casualties and the equipment they have lost over the past several years?
It is massive, and we are only seeing the edges of it right now. And think about the 600,000 young Russian males who have left the country. Who are they? They're the ones with internet savvy, rubles in their pocket, contacts in the West. They've now seen the bright lights of Warsaw. They're not coming back. And that is a generational loss for the Russians. Point two.
By the way, you just made Mika's brother smile talking about the bright lights of Warsaw.
No, old Warsaw is beautiful.
Oh my gosh, are you kidding? It's gorgeous.
Have you been to the Bristol?
I have.
Okay,
oh my gosh,
okay.
so nice.
We'll have Fromer's tour of old Warsaw.
Krakow.
Okay, here we go.
And
we opened up Pandora's box. Go ahead.
And beautifully rebuilt after the tragedy casualty of the Second
Yes,
World War.
yes.
There's a message there.
Yes.
But here's the point I would make to Donald Trump about the money we could spend on Ukraine. We're talking $40 billion a year, which is about 5% of the U.S. defense budget. Our defense budget, $800 billion, $40 billion, about 5%. For that amount of money, we are breaking the phalanx of Russia's military. And those are the best dollars we have ever spent in defense. And point two, all that money, that $40 billion a year, that's not a check we're handing Zelensky. All that money is paid to U.S. defense contractors, making our defense industrial base stronger. Russia gets weaker. To Joe's point, final thought, the Russians today are spending 35% of their GDP on defense. That is not a prescription for long-term growth.
Yeah, Willie, this is a generational impact on Russia. And yes, it's helped U.S. businesses.
Yes,
It is, in one word, for President Trump, it's leverage. This is terrific leverage. You put a small amount of money in, and you get massive effect. This is a good deal for the United
So
States.
speaking of the president-elect, Admiral, he said on the campaign trail, I'll have a peace deal done between Russia and Ukraine. It'll take me one day when I become president. You're writing today in Bloomberg about the possibility of that kind of deal, what it might look like. And you say there ought to be some kind of a DMZ, like there is between North and South Korea. What would that deal look like for both sides?
It would look a lot like the end of the Korean War, Willie, which is to say a demilitarized zone, DMZ, probably 5 to 10 miles wide. It would probably be right along the border that you see now between Russian forces, Ukrainian forces. And that's a tragedy, right? It's a tragedy that Ukraine would give up 20% of its country. But the other 80% sails on. Democratic, free, eventually a path to NATO, say 3 to 5 years, eventually a path to the EU. Not a terrible outcome. A good portion of making that work would be creation of this demilitarized zone, populate it with, on one side, Ukrainian troops, on the other, Russian, like the Korean DMZ, or you could bring in a neutral force, a UN force. You could have NATO on one side, Russia on the other. I could think of a lot of things. All that to be determined at a negotiating table, but it's a key element that people aren't talking
Tragic
about
for
enough.
Ukraine, but let's also say a long way from what Putin wanted when he
That's
set out
exactly
on this war.
the point. When Putin wakes up at 2 o'clock in the morning, when he's honest with himself, he realizes, to Joe's point, he has hurt his country deeply, the Rodina, the motherland. He has destroyed its prospects. In a smart world, Putin would have integrated with Europe. Instead, he's created this confrontation by invading a neighbor. It's a tragedy for Ukraine. It's also a tragedy for Russia.
All right, retired 4-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis, thank you very much. His latest opinion piece is online now. It is worth a read.